أجمعين أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. Continuing our lessons on the book معالم الطريق في طلب العلم of Sheikh Sadhan Hafidhullah Ta'ala, he mentions this sub-chapter. So last week we were talking about books and the books to read in the order and which books to prioritize for beginners. And here he has the second part, Qadir Thaniya, the second issue or point, examples of sharpening the resolve. So here he mentions examples of the ulama of the past and their ambition for talab al-ilm, which is so important for the student of knowledge, that they have these examples. They read the biographies of the ulama, the scholars before, al-salaf al-salih, and even the contemporary scholars to increase their ambition. He says, I mention them because they help in overcoming despair and hopelessness and avoiding someone looking down on themselves or عدم احتقار الذات, يعني having low sense of self. And some people discourage themselves and allow despair to take the root within them. And as we previously mentioned, therefore one should frequently read the biographies of the righteous predecessors, the Salaf al-Salih, for they contain immense benefit and they will help you understand your own worth, your concerns and your efforts, and do not belittle anything. And for Allah has given you an intellect and faculties to aid you in achieving your goal. And then he mentioned lines of poetry, فَكُنْ رَجُلًا رِجْلُهُ فِي الثَّرَى وَهَامَةُ هِمَّتِهِ فِي الثُّرَيَّةِ. That be a man whose foot is on the soil and his ambition, utmost of his ambition, is in the stars. And then he says, never underestimate any act of kindness for some people, any act of goodness, for some people are ignited by a single word, which can profoundly affect them. And then he gives some examples. So in this beginning, we have to pay attention that the talib ilm, if he has good thoughts of himself, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is kareem, is generous, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant you the knowledge. If you work hard and take the proper means and make dua and you're sincere, as we study those, you can make it the goals you wish to achieve. So this is important because when you read the biography of Salaf, they were just like us when they first started. They didn't know. So here he begins with the first example. He mentions in the Kitab Sahih al-Bukhari, was the most authentic book in Islam after the Quran, the noble Quran. And if a narrator is included in the Sahih al-Bukhari, then it is mentioned by the ulama, then that narrator قد جاوز القنطرة, يعني that narrator has passed the qantara, means this person's narrative is absolutely authentic because Bukhari narrated from him. This is the level Bukhari has, the status of it. So he says, what was the reason for Imam al-Bukhari to compile the Sahih? It's mentioned a single word spoken in a single gathering that resonated and touched Imam al-Bukhari rahimahullah, that Allah facilitated for him the compilation of the Sahih Bukhari and elevated his status and rank. And what happened was that he said, it was narrated in his biography, that he was sitting in class of Ishaq ibn Rahawayya, his teacher rahimahullah, and he said in the class, Ishaq said, if one of you would only compile a book all with authentic hadith or authentic narrations from the Sunnah of the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So this is what he said. If only one of you would be able to gather in a book all that which is authentic from Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Right? Jumla wahida, one sentence, right? So what happened then is that when he said this, and Bukhari says it fell into my heart that I wanted to be the one who did that, and from there he went. So you see, sometimes when you think about this, it's a very powerful reality. In the class you can get inspiration to go far. But imagine that person thinks to himself, I'm nothing, I know nothing, I'm not going to go far, I'm not going to learn anything. Then you're not going to go far because of your own self. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is generous, but you're yourself kind of restricting that which is vast. وَفَوْقَ كُلِّ ذِي عِلْمٍ عَلِيمٍ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can teach you and benefit you. And we have to have that kind of mindset, that we can become the next mujaddid. Yes, that's how you have to think. You might not become it, but that's your intention. But if you come to the class, I'm just a attendee, I'm a guest, you're not going anywhere because you started with yourself. You have bad thoughts of your own self. And this is not like that only in the time of the Salaf. After, mentioned now biography Imam al-Dhahabi. So Imam al-Dhahabi, rahimahullah, what happened with him, it's narrated, right? As we know Dhahabi's biography, he's a great Imam. Subki, he mentions, for example, in his biography, right, about him, he's his teacher, right? Dhahabi taught Subki. He says, as for our Ustad, our teacher, Abu Abdullah, he possessed unparalleled insight and knowledge and treasures that is sought after, what in refuge, the treasure that is, right? It says here that as for our teacher Abu Abdullah, that he is one who has, right, insight, la nadhir lahu, there has no comparator to it, and is a kenzun, right, which only can be, right, sought after with difficulty. And he was a leading authority in memorization, master of hadith in his time, meaning and words. And he continues the biography praising him. But so now the Shaykh's point is to mention how the Imam Dhahabi become inspired to study hadith. Imam Dhahabi was Imam in hadith, in tafsir, in history, all these different ulum. So he says, it was mentioned in the biography, Imam Dhahabi, and he mentions, it's sent in the Muqaddimah about him, that once his teacher, Imam Alamuddin al-Brizari, he said he saw me writing, and he said this handwriting, when he saw my handwriting, he said this handwriting resembles the handwriting of the scholars of hadith. So he said, since that day, hadith sciences became beloved to me. You see, this is how the teacher inspired the student, just that good word. Right? Just one word. And this is the power of also having good thoughts to yourself, that when you hear these praises, you take it with you, inshallah, and try your best. So Imam Dhahabi, rahimahullah, the Shaykh says, consider this effect of one statement on Imam Dhahabi, that he became one of the scholars, memorizing critics of hadith. Like as we know today, Imam Dhahabi is considered an authority without a dispute by everyone. But due to this, by the fact, so he became a Dhahabi, literally. So here, when we look at this, the Shaykh's point now is going to mention another example. He mentioned this to show you how these great Imams, they were inspired by one statement, but at the same time that we should have good thoughts of yourself, that inshallah ta'ala you can also achieve these things. And another example, Muhammad bin Nasr, he mentions in his kitab Mukhtasar Qiyam al-Layl, that Sila bin Ashham, one of the Salaf, Sila bin Ashyam, he says he would go often into the outskirts to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He would pass by some young men who were playing and having fun. And he would say to them, tell me about a group of people who, if they intend to travel somewhere, but they get deviated from the path during the daytime and they sleep at nighttime, when will they complete their journey? So he would pass by them and say this to them. And he's giving a method about them. Right? Somebody is trying to reach a goal. The daytime he plays, nighttime he sleeps. So the example is a person, a believer, right? He's not doing ibadah at night, he's not doing ibadah in the day, he's just wasting time, and he's traveling to Allah. So he says that one day a young man amongst them realized what he was saying. And he said to these people, right, O people, by Allah, he's only referring to us. We play during the day and we sleep at night. So that young man followed Sila and he became one of his students and he went off to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and become better. One word, and he continued to repeat that. He guided them to that. So the Shaykh said, therefore, never underestimate any act of kindness or goodness. Perhaps you can read a short book, attend a scholarly gathering led by a student, and hear a word that stirs something in you, and the extent which you are unaware, and you may get much benefit from it. And this is the reality. Coming to the classes is one of the benefits. You get inspired by something you hear. You say, I want to research that. I want to look into that more. And then from there you continue. You become inspired. And from our times, the story, for example, of Shaykh Muqbil, rahimahullah. So Shaykh Muqbil, rahimahullah, is mentioned, he mentions it himself, that how did he write, or why did he write a Sahih al-Musnad? And he mentions that when he was studying the Jami'ah al-Islamiyya in Medina, one of his teachers, they say his name is Abdul bin Rashid al-Najdi, he said, he used to say in the class that outside the Sahihain, the hadith which are authentic, you can count on your fingers. So Shaykh Muqbil, rahimahullah, said, when I used to study with him, I always used to feel that this is wrong. This kalam is batil. So he said I was inspired in that time, then resolved, I got to prove it. Prove it wrong. So for the rest of his life, he wrote Sahih Muslim not one time. He continued to edit it up until the day he died. Right, close to the day, like editing it. That's why there's more than one, like the edition, the nearest. But he kept adding, removing, checking. And what is inspired in that one statement, the Shaykh said, I think is wrong. And sometimes many of us might be motivated this way. Right? For example, you might hear an opinion, I don't agree with that. Okay, so then go research it. And off you go. But sometimes what happens, you don't intend, you think bad about yourself, then at the end of the day, you're doing yourself a disservice. We have to have higher ambitions. And this is a beautiful example for us too, that when you come to the class, you're actively learning, you're listening, you're paying attention, you're planning, you're thinking. Talib al-ilm should be this way, should be active. Should be sitting in their class, in one ear, out the other. Rather, you're thinking, and inshallah ta'ala, Allah will inspire you. Then the Shaykh now mentions some examples of zeal. And the ulama, they're great examples of zeal. And this is very important when we're feeling lazy. We read the biography of the great Imam, Shaykh al-Islam Taymiyyah, rahimahullah. It said about him, right? And he said, the Shaykh said, we all know him. He was reported about this great determination, may Allah have mercy upon him, that if he was perplexed by a matter, anything make difficult for him, he would not rest until he found the answer. And he stated by himself at the end of the commentary of Surah An-Nur, that there is no disagreement amongst the companions regarding the interpretation of the verses of the Quran that describe Allah's attributes. And I've studied the commentaries transmitted from the companions and the hadiths narrated, and I've examined numerous books, both large and small, and more than 100 tafasir. Yet to this day I have not found a single companion who interpreted any one of the verses or hadiths regarding Allah's attributes in a way that contradicts the well-known meaning. Allahu Akbar. This is why when he spoke in the Munadhara Wasatiyya, no one could say anything. Because imagine, 100 tafasir. When he says, here I checked all of them, what it means is there is no such thing, doesn't exist. And brothers and sisters, we have to think about this. This great Imam, in order to ensure that the truth, he did all this work. So when you go now and look at the example, the Munadhara debate, when it came to his Aqidah Wasatiyya, he defended his debate, he won the debate, even though it was, again, one versus all of the Ash'aris or that time, or the big Imams, the judges amongst them. And he was Hanbali and they're Shafi'i, so it was also unfair too. But in any case, he still beat them in the argument. And he said, give him 3 years to find a single evidence against what I said, and no one could present it. 3 years. And this is because Ibn Hajar says, if Shaykh Islam Ibn Taymiyyah says there's no evidence, you just be certain there's no evidence. He does what's called istiqra' tam, absolute induction. There's no evidence beyond that. It means when Ibn Taymiyyah says this is the method of Salaf, or there's no proof, it means I checked everything. I checked it all, there isn't, based on his knowledge. And again, what was the kind of knowledge he had? A knowledge which, if you were to research it, again, 100 tafasir, he checks everything available. So this shows us the great determination for him to make these statements that gives us the certainty that when we say Ibn Taymiyyah said something, it's not something small. Even though, again, we don't blindfold anyone, as Brother Majid was mentioning. But to show you the statement that the Imam is not something small. But imagine, brothers and sisters, this is how the ulama used to be and still are. That they make the effort. So me and you, we could do the same. The only difference would be, are you going to check 100 tafasir, or are you going to just take whatever you find? You have to push yourself. And a contemporary example is the Imam al-Tafsir of our time, Shaykh Muhammad Amin al-Shinqiti, rahimahullah. And we know Shaykh al-Shinqiti, rahimahullah, is an expert in tafsir. Again, many of the ulama say that if any Imam or Shaykh was worthy of becoming Shaykh al-Islam, although many of our ulama refer to this and can be deserving the title, it would be him. Right? Shaykh al-Islam, who is Shinqiti anyways, he's a teacher of Shaykh Uthaymeen. He's a teacher of the ulama, he's a friend of them, but he's considered one of the biggest shuyukh of our time. His student, Shaykh Atiyya Salim, he mentioned the Bulugh Maram, when he's talking about bahath and research, he says, encouraging us to research, he said, one day I heard our Shaykh, Waliduna Shaykh Al-Amin, rahimahullah, Shaykh Shinqiti, one day he said to me, about a mas'ala, I spent 10 years researching this mas'ala until I found in the Book of Allah. 10 years on one mas'ala until I found the Book of Allah. See, things like this, it's not imagination, brother and sister. He lived earlier than our time, but he's in our time, in our era. And later, if you look at Shinqiti, when he's mentioned by his biography, you have to read his biography about how he even did the tafsir. He said, but he mentioned when he would sit down to tafsir, he has no resources in front of him, just a paper and a pen. And he said, Allah brought everything to my mind and I just write it. Ilham min Allah. But he mentioned before he even got started, every ayat. There's no ayah in the Quran except I know what's said about it by every scholar before me. I know everything about it. So these kinds of imams who inspire us, brothers, they work so hard that we can do it, inshallah ta'ala, if we put the effort in. But we shouldn't think, for example, that this ilm is closed door. And some people, that's what they think, is khalas, the ulama have done the job. Our job is just to blind follow, or to play around. No, rather we have to make the same efforts to protect the deen, defend it against the doubts and the troublemakers and the modernists and all these other people. At the same time, also help ourselves. Another example, Imam Abu Ja'far Muhammad ibn Jarir al-Tabari. Ibn Jarir al-Tabari, everyone knows him. Ibn Jarir al-Tabari, rahimahullah, the great Imam, he says this man's story is truly remarkable. If the number of pages he wrote were divided by his entire lifespan, he would write 60 pages and more every day, based on his output and his age. And this is truly astonishing. He suggested to his students that they write a history of Islam or a commentary on the Quran, so he ordered 30,000 pages to be brought. And they replied, this is a lengthy task, even for the swiftest amounts. And he then admonished him, saying, Allah is Allahu Akbar, Allah is the greatest. Ambitions have died. Bring 3,000 pages instead. Right? So imagine, right? And this is not like the first time, right, it was mentioned about him. And if you go to his biography, his time, all the great Imams, many of them are alive, and you have to read his seerah too, brothers and sisters. He had a lot of problems at his time. A lot of fitna happened. Tabari went through a lot. Today we know his status, but at his time he went through a lot of difficulties. But one thing they mentioned that the ulama, they would come to read his tafsir al-Tabari, which we have today on our phones and the computers. So Imam Ibn Khuzaymah, his student, He said one day I came to him because that time the Hanabila and Shafi'iyya had a lot of problems. And what is Tabari's madhab? Shafi'i, right? So he was getting right, he's on the weaker side, let's just say that at that time. So what happened was that Ibn Khuzaymah was also on the Shafi'i side. So he said, I came one day to visit him, and he didn't have the ability to teach. He was also still not allowed to teach at that time. So I came and I read his tafsir, the whole of it, imagine, the whole tafsir Tabari. And I said, there's nobody under the sky more knowledgeable than him. And if someone had to go to China to read this book, it'd be worth it. Imagine, the first benefit, he read the whole book. Tafsir Tabari, you see how big it is, right? He read it all, he said, I couldn't believe. He's the most knowledgeable scholar in the face of the earth. And these are the ulama we're talking about. So we have to aspire when we feel lazy. And what are we lazy about? Just come to the class, and it's not even difficult. I'm talking about more than attendance. We have to try to imagine that what we're doing is what they were doing. And inshallah ta'ala, if you do what they did, inshallah ta'ala, you get to where they were. This is the goal, to get to where they go, where they were. Imam Nawawi mentions about him, he says also a remarkable story. For he was about 45 years old, and when he died. And his works are found in libraries, approximately 20 volumes or more. And he attended 12 lessons a day, as we said, and he wrote commentary on Sahih Bukhari and Muslim. And he also wrote on Tahdhib al-Asma wal-Lughat, right, a book on definitions and terminologies and stuff like this. Rawd al-Talibin, which is considered the Mu'tamid of the Shafi'i madhab. And al-Majmu', and perhaps is considered by the Shafi'is, Kitab al-Majmu' is like a Mughni for the Hanbalis, يعني Ibn Qudama's Mughni. In Hanbali madhab is like the Majmu' and the for the Shafi'iyya. And it also has other books, Riyadh Salihin, Adhkar, Arba'in Nawawi. And then the Shaykh mentions, like, look at his book, Al-Majmu', just a benefit. It's not all written by him. Nawawi, he wrote most of it, but he didn't finish it. It was 3 scholars who wrote it together, but the book is attributed to him largely because he wrote most of it. So he mentions, for example, Subki and Muti'i and Nawawi, all of them wrote the book. So Nawawi went from the beginning of the book to Kitab al-Riba and Buyu', and then he continued Subki and another one finished it. In any case, all these books in a short span. And maybe he's in his 40s. And they mentioned when they look at Nawawi's life. Yeah, he did all of that. In our time today, Hafid Hakami, rahimahullah, is an example. If you go to his biography, you will see an example of somebody who is like, for us, like this, died very young, and he did a lot. So in his biography, they mentioned Hafid Hakami, rahimahullah. Many of us, we know him. Hafid al-Hakami, we studied his, from the Fajr, he taught the Usul. Many of us read it, and some of us even were memorizing it. If you go to his biography, it's just another example of an Imam of our time who worked so hard with so little time. And one of the things they mentioned about him was his hifd, because he's called Hafid for a reason, that he mentioned when he was young, when the Hilal Ramadan came in. So Ramadan came in. Later Ramadan, he will read 1 juz ba'd al-dhuhr, hifdan, then read the whole juz in Tarawih. And every night he did that till he finished the Quran. So how many days? 1 month. So this is mentioned by Ahmad Najmi as well. He said we were doing hizb, he was doing the whole juz. After Dhuhr he reviews it, then Salat Tarawih he reads it, leads it, the next day he does the next one, till he finished the whole Quran. And this is why he's called Hafid. He looks at it, it's in his heart. Until the point that Qara'awi, his teacher, rahimahullah, mentioned that one day he needed to borrow books. There's no printing press brothers at that time. Us today, we just photocopy PDF. So he has a PDF, it's Hafid Hakami. He has a scanner. He said, I need a book. He took it from the library. He said, I need to write this book. Don't worry, he said. Hafid Hakim wrote the whole book, Khalq Af'al al-Ibad, one night. He said, gave back. Is it done? Is it done? Because he has someone like him, brothers. It's like a scanner. He just copies the whole book in one night. And he memorized it too, because if he looks at it, it's hard. These are the ulama of our time, but we have to, brothers and sisters, imagine. If we have people like this, we can look up to, inspire us, then there's no shortage. The more we read about them, the more you want to push yourself. And these are real stories. If you read his biography, highly encouraged to read it. Hafid Hakami and Abdul Qara'awi, especially Qara'awi's and his da'wah, you'll be astonished. One man whom did tajdeed of a whole region south of Saudi Arabia, it's unbelievable, his story, if you read his biography. So these ulama, the sheikhs bringing one after the other. He mentioned Hafid ibn Hajar, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, author of Fath al-Bari, a commentary on Sahih Bukhari. As we know, he's not the first to write it, because Ibn Rajab went ahead, but Ibn Rajab didn't finish. He finished the Kitab al-Janaiz, he passed away. So Ibn Hajar, he has his Fath al-Bari, and he wrote it, the entirety of it. And he says, it was mentioned by Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun, he said, a commentary on Bukhari remains a debt on this ummah. Means owing on the ummah, someone write a Sharh al-Bukhari. So As-Sakhawi, when he's commenting, he says, As-Sakhawi, the student of Ibn Hajar, Ibn Khaldun passed away, he didn't get to see Fath al-Bari. The debt is already been paid now. The debt's been paid now, I mean it's finished. Ibn Rajab, Ibn Hajar, when he finished Fath al-Bari, the Ummah has been freed of the debt of that. Because if you read Fath al-Bari with us, that book is a library. Shaykh Muqbil said it's a library by itself. It is. It's a book by itself. Today the ulama, they try to analyze how much books did he have to write that book. Shaykh Salih al-Shaykh, in one of the lectures, he was talking about libraries, and he said, Allah only knows how big the library he sat in. It was a waqf in that time, Salah ibn Ayyubi's time, or after, sorry. There was a waqf in Azhar, or in that region in Egypt, that was belonging to the Awqaf of Egypt. Hajar was sitting there and he would write his commentary. He says, Wallahu a'lam how many books were in there. We don't know. And some ulama try to source every book and resource used by Ibn Hajar. And they put in one book. And most of them, we don't have them. So he used them freely until he wrote Fath al-Bari, a book that is unparalleled in the history of, if you could say, of Islam, in terms of the way that he wrote it, even though he's not the first to write it. And it's also a fa'idah that he's not the only one to write Sharh al-Bukhari at his time. Abu Bakr al-Aini, he also wrote one. Al-Aini is Hanafi and he's Shafi'i Ibn Hajar. And they had some issues. So Al-Aini tried to outclass Ibn Hajar. Right? So if you read, you have to know, if you read Umdat al-Qari, you have to know in the beginning of the book, that was, you can see, Al-Aini was going to write a commentary bigger and better than Ibn Hajar's. But he couldn't, because in the beginning he put so much effort, each volume was big, until the end he got smaller and smaller and smaller, because he ran out of time and energy. As Ibn Hajar in Muqaddimah, he says, I was going to write a book bigger than this, but I realized life is short, so I made it summarized. That's a summary. The Fath al-Bari they have, he could have done more, he said, but the life is short. And he was correct at what he did. And Shaykh Abdul Karim al-Khudayr, he talks about this because he specialized in these things. He talks about these differences, and you notice that. If you read his book, the beginning book of his book, the fawaid he brings, the i'rab and tafsir, everything he brings, mashallah, at the end he couldn't do it, he ran out of the time. So the reason Fath al-Bari is so unique is that he's consistent, but also the fact that look at the effort. More than that, he says in the beginning of the book, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, when he does takhrij of the hadith, Ibn Hajar says that he checked 100 sources. Right? He checked about 100 different sources just to source that, or like dozens of books just to source that narration. Right? Sorry, أكثر من 100 juz, more than 100 different books just to source the hadith. Right? So this is important to make sure he gets the chain of transmission. Also, he mentioned about him that he read Mu'jam al-Saghir al-Tabarani from Dhuhr ila Asr. He finished the whole reading of the book in one sitting from Dhuhr ila Asr. And that's not the only one that he did. If you go back to Bakr ibn Zayd's book, he talks about all the books he read one after another. There's a qira'ah, right? Reading. Right? Imagine just to read the book. And also memorizing, this is another thing. But also Ibn Hajar, if you read his biography, it's also, he knew the 10 qira'at. And his story is full of ilm. But what is important? Look at the effort they're making. Then he talks about the salaf now. He says, for example, you go down to the great Imam Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, rahimahullah, who it's mentioned about him, Ibn Hajar says in Taqrib, that his eminence and mastery, right, are unanimous. They are considered, like, agreed upon that. That this great Imam, in terms of his ascription, right, to Zuhra, which is from Quraysh, he says about him, Ibn Hajar in Taqrib, that muttafaqun ala jalalatihi, they agreed upon his nobility and his itqani, his perfection. Shaykh Muqbil ibn Hadi al-Wadi said Ibn Hajar was correct and excellent in choosing his expression. His eminence and mastery are unanimously agreed upon, because with this, Al-Hafiz rejected all the anomalous and weak narration that might suggest a flaw in Zuhri. May Allah have mercy upon him. And this Imam, Az-Zuhri, it said, he would go to the elderly and the old and young and the women in seclusion, asking them questions, engaging in discussions with them until he acquired the knowledge. It means he used to seek knowledge from anybody who had it, old, young, until he gained the knowledge that he has. And we know Imam Zuhri's status, right? He's a great Imam of Hadith and other fiqh. And the Shaykh mentions other examples here too. He mentions this scholar, Abu al-Fadl bin Nabhan and Adib. He said, I saw the scholar Abu al-Ala in one of the masjids of Baghdad writing while standing, because the lamp was high up. Because the lamp was too high, so he stood up to write. Which means, the Shaykh says, his remarkable ambition made him one of the most famous scholars of Islam, and he did not attain his knowledge through merely wishful thinking or dormant, rather through something that settled in his heart. And his effort. And this is what we notice about our ulama, that they make effort like that. Today, again, the light is easy for us. But imagine time as the Imams, some of them had to write outside in the street, because the street light, they didn't have a light. They had to use a lamp to write from there in the streets. Right? And this is the great effort they would make And we give another example from scholars of our time, Imam al-Albani, rahimahullah. Many of us are familiar with, but we should read his biography. Right? Ahl Sunnah, we have to read the biographies of ulama Ahl Sunnah. A lot of times we know of them, but we don't know about them. We have to know more about them. So he's mentioned by his student that Shaykh Albani, I heard him one day say, sometimes it takes me hours to complete the takhrij of a hadith, to find all the sources for it, and sometimes days, and sometimes I spend weeks fi hadith wahid, on one hadith. So when you see Shaykh Albani's books, how many hadith he checked? We said like something like 13 plus thousand hadith. And look at what he's doing. This is what we're doing. These hours, weeks. And this is how much effort they're putting in. So when they say authenticate Imam Albani, it's not a statement, it's not a cheap statement. It's a real statement, right, brothers? It's somebody who put in effort. And another example would be his only work ethic, right? Shaykh Albani is by himself. It's a whole research some people have done. Shaykh Albani's work ethic and productivity. They did a whole PhD or study on him just to see how Shaykh Albani even did all this. Again, the same student said, I came to him one day after Fajr by about 5 or 10 minutes, and he was sitting writing, and he sat like that until 7 o'clock, and they kept going until 2 hours passed, and then it passed more time until 9, till 10, and then the Shaykh took a break, then he came back, and he kept going like this, and he took a break. So I asked, when does the Shaykh sleep? He said he sleeps a little bit after that long duration, and he takes a nap maybe after Asr, right? And then after that, he continues to work up until middle of the night. That's Shaykh Albani's work. He's going like this, and this is how he's producing all those works until some of the ulama, they say that's when we realize why Imam Albani is ahead of us. Shaykh Umar Falata, he mentions, contemporary Imam Hadith. He says, I remember I used to be the neighbor of Shaykh Albani in Medina. When he was teaching in Medina, I used to see his house across. I could see the light. So we wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, I look at across, I see the light Shaykh Albani is on. Right? So they said, that's why he became Albani, we're not. It's at night. And sometimes his wife mentions, I couldn't find him at night. And they was sleeping in the bed, he's not there. I see him in the night writing something. And some ulama mentioned that was the ulama hadith. They couldn't sleep, something comes to their head, they get up, they write it down. And at that time they put the light on, put the lamp, again it's candle, write it, put it off, come back up again, and do it again and again. Brothers, these are the kinds of things, if you hear them, you feel amazed. But at the same time, the Shaykh's point in this whole section, encouraging our ambition, inshallah ta'ala, to grow. And also when you hear about it, when you feel lazy, you know what to do now. If you're lazy, you've been missing a lot of weeks, you don't have to wait for Fajr to kick you out of the group. Right? You have to get the biographies, read it, and then come to the class. Some of us, what are you waiting for? You should already know. Right? If you're missing something wrong, you need to get the ambition. Some brothers also, they don't realize what's happening to them. It's not the fact that you don't want to learn. Maybe you're not as aspirous as somebody else. You forgot the hadith, what was the goal? Why are you trying to seek the knowledge again? For Allah's sake, but also what the Imam sacrificed, what's our musharaka, what's our participation? Another example, he mentioned one of the Imams in the past, he used to write, right, the books. He said he copied Ibn Sa'd's Kitab Tabaqat and Tariq Baghdad. He wrote it with his own hand, and if we were to gather all parts of these two books, many of us would find them burdensome, even incapable of writing that. Right? Imagine writing it by hand, the whole books. And Muzani mentions about him, that he said, I read the book Al-Risala, Imam Shafi'i, his teacher, on the subject Usul al-Fiqh 50 times. And that's why Al-Muzani is considered Al-Muzani, right? In the madhab of the Shafi'iyya. So great Imams, look at this, 50 times. And again, the subject Usul al-Fiqh, Imam Shafi'i, right? We're known for it. He says also here, Abdullah bin Muhammad, a faqih of Iraq, he studied the book Al-Mughni 23 times. Right? So, brothers, Al-Mughni, how big it is, right? We know. They're reading it one after another. And then Al-Hurr bin Abdul Rahman said, I sought the grammatical analysis, grammatical subject al-Nahu, I'rab, of the Quran for 45 or 40 some odd years. And this is very difficult. I'rab al-Quran is unique, right? Because I'rab is different types, but the Quran is the most challenging one because the possibilities are different, right? Some difference of opinion, perhaps possible interpretations of the different ayat and the sentences. So he says, these are men whose determination is like mountains. Neither desires, nor the comforts of life, nor the pursuit of ease and comfort deter them, but as it was said, from the inkwell to the grave. Right? In mihbara ila maqbara. That's the statement of the ulama, from the inkwell, the pot they used to write, into the grave. This is how it should be. And he mentions many other examples. Maybe mention a few more. We'll take I stop with that much. Ibrahim al-Harabi is mentioned that he said, Abu al-Abbas al-Tha'lab said, I have not missed a single grammatical or class or lugha or grammar, nahu wala lugha, for 50 years. 50 years. And it says here that Ibrahim Harbi, he would frequent the circles of knowledge until he reached such a high level of scholarship and status. Okay, so Afwan, Abu al-Abbas Ta'al said about Ibrahim al-Harbi. 50 years, he didn't miss in Lugha or in Nahu class. 50 years. And these are the difficult subjects, right? This shows you the determination they had, that these Imams were doing this. He says also, it mentioned that he reached the level when it comes to the ilm and the status that we find of some of the companions of Imam Ahmed and likes. And that's how big he is in hadith. Forget about this subject. This is also in hadith too. Muhammad bin Ahmed bin Qudama, he wrote many things by his own hand, right? Many things. And he says by himself that he wrote the Tafsir al-Baghawi, al-Mughni, Hilya Abu Nu'aym, al-Iban ibn Battah. Right? So the book, I think it's maybe the Kubra, Wallahu Alam, but the book Majid is teaching. And Khiraqi, and he wrote the Quran also many times. Imagine writing with the hand, but it's a sabr they had. Al-Jawhari says, any hadith, Ibrahim al-Jawhari said about him, he said, any hadith I do not have from 100 various chains of transmission, then I'm considered just an orphan in that. يعني فيه يتيم, يعني I don't have much. So what they would do is take one matan and they find as many asanid. That's how they grow the strength of the hadith, but also what it meant that they were memorized the hadith. Because there's not a million hadith. So how would you know the hadith? One hadith and multiple chains. Every chain is considered a hadith. So imagine every hadith 100. If it's not 100, it's miskeen. They didn't do much to my team. And these are the efforts that they would put. And he would travel seeking it, investigating, examining until he collected the greatest number of chain transmission he could. Abu Hussein al-Asadi, he said about him, he devoted himself to teaching. He sat for 50 years in one masjid, teaching people and instructing them in religion. And his resolve never wavered and his determination never faltered. It's not surprising, for when sincerity of intention and effort are combined, Allah makes things easy, that which is difficult. That which was difficult becomes easy, and that which is far becomes near. And this is the reality, brothers and sisters, that when we read these biographies and these points that he's mentioning, the main effort, his question is how? It's because the ikhlas was so strong that he allowed them to continue to come even when nobody would come. Right? If you look at some of the biographies, some of the classes, nobody's even there maybe. But it didn't deter them. Right? Sometimes that's another thing. Sometimes people wonder, is it a big class? Is it a popular class? What is the subject? That's not the question that we should be asking. Is it beneficial? We go for it. So, for example, Imam Malik, rahmahullah, you mentioned about him, that when he was studying, in the beginning stages, we sat with Nafi'. He said, we'll sit down, sometimes nobody's there. Just me and another person, just sitting to learn. It's not. So these are important that we try our best to grow our intentions by remember that whatever you're doing, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is recording. And we mentioned inshallah one more. Khalif ibn Hisham, he says, Hamdan ibn Hani al-Muqri said, I heard him say, I was perplexed or confused by a chapter of grammar. So I spent 80,000 dirhams on it until I mastered it. And he did not take it lightly because it is knowledge. Therefore, do not take lightly any matter that comes your way without trying to understand it. Even if the only benefit were to accustom yourself to diligence and research into what you do not understand, that will be enough. You may experience worry and sadness if you encounter a matter or research you don't understand, but this worry itself is a blessing because it indicates, inshallah, a burning desire. And this is the benefit, that if you don't understand something, that means that's the time you're going to make the effort. It's a good sign. If you came to class, you didn't get it, I have to find out what it's all about. I have to go home and research, or I'm going to ask the teacher after, and I got to review it. That's a good sign. Not, I didn't get it, khalas, time to retire and give up. And some of us, we notice that, right? And we look carefully at the dunya, we don't do it. But the deen, it comes, right? Dunya, you go to the first day job, it's horrible, right? You didn't quit. When it comes to ilm, you come, I don't know what's going on. Okay, to find out what's going on. Why are you just waiting for someone to tell you? Right? It doesn't work like that. But some people, that's what they do. They come to class, I don't know what kitab it is, I don't know what he's teaching. I guess not for me. And what does that mean? I guess you don't want Allah's blessings? You don't want Allah to favor you with His understanding? No, what's happening is that shaitan is telling you, just get up and go. It's not for you. But when it comes to dunya, we don't do that. Dunya, we're day and night struggling, and we become, mashallah, many of us become masters, ulama in the dunya. When it comes to the deen, we can do it, brothers. It's just, inshallah, Allah's tawfiq. But the goal is also not just the status, it's also, like I said, all the things you mentioned before. Ikhlas, ilm, amal, da'wah. The main thing we have to understand what we're trying to benefit from. So inshallah ta'ala, next week we'll continue. He mentions more examples, so inshallah we'll read them maybe next week. If anyone has any quick questions, inshallah ta'ala, we'll take them. Yes, brother. So in there, the Shaykh mentions about Shaykh Ibn Taymiyyah that certain Nur, that there's no disagreement amongst the companions. So he narrates Ibn Taymiyyah that he said this, that they never make ta'weel or any kind of interpretation of the sifat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the point we're mentioning is Shaykh Ibn Taymiyyah, when he says this, how did he reach that conclusion? He says that I have read and examined numerous books, both large and small, more than 100 tafsir, 100 of them, 100 tafsir, just to get to that point. So the reason why this means that Ibn Taymiyyah, when he concludes that the Sahaba never did, right, any kind of interpretation of the sifat, he's doing it bi-istiqra, in what we call induction or inference, which is tam, complete. There's two types of istiqra. Istiqra naqis with tam. Naqis means you have some examples, but you didn't encompass every example possible, so you're making an inference, a judgment on some of the knowledge of what you know. But when you do complete, we call it deduction in science, right? You looked at every possible example, and you couldn't find it other than that. So this is almost very difficult to do anything. Ibn Taymiyyah, one benefit that Ibn Hajar was saying, when Ibn Taymiyyah says there is no proof, he's a sahib, a person who does istiqra tam. That means there isn't. You go look for it, you won't find it either. So that's why Shaykh Ibn Taymiyyah, when he says something like this, there's the Salaf did this, or they never did. Some people, they just think Ibn Taymiyyah just saying things. They don't get it. Like what he means that he studied all the matter, and he couldn't find. So that's a great benefit to show us that even to prove the point, he did the work. He didn't just say, there's no proof for it. And so sometimes what we have to do is have to respect that, but also show us, inshallah ta'ala, we can learn from this how Shaykh Ibn Taymiyyah gained that knowledge. And this is also encouragement for us as well, like to try to work like them, inshallah ta'ala. Any other questions? طيب, inshallah. We'll end with this much. سبحانك بحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.